The air in the exclusive airport lounge was thick with a silence that felt expensive. It was a quiet hum of hushed conversations, the soft clinking of porcelain, and the gentle rustle of financial newspapers. In a plush armchair tucked away in a corner, a woman sat, a picture of calm. She was in her late 30s, perhaps, with a kind face that didn't seem to belong to the world of sharp angles and expensive watches around her. She wore a simple, dark gray sweater, the kind you buy for comfort and not for labels, and well-fitting black trousers. Her only luggage was a single, soft leather tote bag resting at her feet, looking worn and loved, as if it had been on 100 journeys with her. She wasn't reading a tablet or scrolling through a phone. Instead, she held a book, its pages soft and dog-eared. It was a history of cartography, a heavy and serious-looking tome that she seemed completely absorbed in. Every so often, she would take a sip of her water, her eyes never leaving the page. She had an aura of stillness about her, a quiet confidence that required no external validation. She was an island of tranquility in a sea of quiet ambition. This peace was abruptly shattered by the arrival of a small party. It seemed to suck all the air out of the room. A woman, probably in her 50s, swept in first, draped in a silk scarf that probably cost more than the lounge's monthly rent. Her hair was sculpted into a helmet of perfect blonde. Her fingers were heavy with rings that glittered under the recessed lighting. She was followed by a much younger woman, a carbon copy in training, with a designer handbag clutched in her hand like a weapon and a look of perpetual, mild anxiety on her face. Bringing up the rear was a man in a pinstripe suit, his face flushed with self-importance, his voice booming despite the lounge's atmosphere. I told them, "We can't possibly be expected to fly on a plane that doesn't have the correct vintage of champagne," the man was saying, his voice carrying across the quiet space. "It's a matter of principle. The brand is everything." The older woman laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Oh, Richard, you're so right. It's the little details that separate us from everyone else." Her eyes scanned the room, a quick dismissive sweep that categorized and judged in a fraction of a second. Her gaze passed over the woman in the gray sweater, lingering for a moment with a flicker of contempt before moving on. As if she were just another piece of the furniture, the younger woman chimed in, her voice a high-pitched echo. "Absolutely, Beatrice. I was reading that they're letting more people upgrade using points now. Can you imagine? It completely dilutes the experience." The trio settled into a cluster of seats near the large window, their voices a constant, intrusive hum. They spoke of people they knew, of deals they had made, of holidays they had taken. Each story a carefully crafted brick in the wall they were building between themselves and the rest of the world. The woman in the gray sweater turned a page in her book, her expression unchanged. She had registered their arrival, of course. She had heard their loud, performative conversation, but it didn't seem to touch her. She remained in her own quiet world, a world of maps and long-forgotten explorers. When the call for boarding finally came, the trio was up in a flash, gathering their numerous bags and coats with an air of urgency. They pushed their way to the front of the small queue that had formed, ignoring the other passengers who had been waiting patiently. Beatrice gave a pointed look to the gate agent, as if to say, "Do you know who we are?" They were the first to step onto the air bridge, their heads held high. The woman in the gray sweater waited until the initial rush had subsided. She calmly bookmarked her page, closed her book, and slipped it into her tote. She walked to the gate, offered a small, polite smile to the agent, and followed the others down the long, sterile corridor. Stepping onto the plane was like entering a different world. The first-class cabin was a cocoon of soft gray leather and warm ambient lighting. The air smelled faintly of leather and something clean like ozone. Each seat was a private pod, a promise of comfort and solitude for the long journey ahead. The cabin crew, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved with a quiet efficiency, their smiles professional and welcoming. The trio was already making their presence known. Beatrice was standing in the aisle, her hands on her hips, blocking the path of other passengers. "Excuse me," she said to a flight attendant, her voice sharp. "Is this it? I was told the seats on this aircraft were the new suites. These seem..." rather small. The flight attendant, a woman with a remarkably patient face, maintained her professional smile. "These are our new first-class suites, madam. They offer complete privacy and lie-flat beds. I'm sure you'll find them very comfortable." Richard was already squeezing his bulky carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, grunting with effort. "They've certainly made these bins smaller. A disgrace. How is a man supposed to travel?" He complained to no one in particular. The woman in the gray sweater found her seat a few rows back. On the opposite side of the aisle, it was a window seat, which she preferred. She didn't have a large bag to contend with, just her tote. She lifted it easily into the compartment, her movements fluid and unhurried. She then settled into her seat, running her hand over the soft, cool leather of the armrest. She took a moment to look out the window at the bustling activity on the tarmac. The baggage handlers, the fuel trucks, the choreographed dance of the airport. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. From her seat, she had a clear view of the trio. Beatrice was now complaining about the placement of the magazines in the seat pocket. The younger woman, Tiffany, was taking selfies, pouting her lips and adjusting her hair, trying to find the perfect angle that captured the designer logo on her headrest. Richard had already unbuttoned his suit jacket and was scrolling through his phone, his face a mask of bored superiority. A senior flight attendant, a man with kind eyes and neatly combed silver hair, was moving through the cabin, greeting passengers personally. When he reached the woman in the gray sweater, his smile widened, becoming less formal and more genuine. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he said, his voice low and warm. "It's a pleasure to have you with us again. We've prepared your usual selection of herbal teas. Is there anything else I can get for you before we depart?" The woman looked up at him, her own smile warm and friendly. "That's very thoughtful of you, Thomas. You have a good memory. A glass of water would be lovely for now." "Thank you," of course, Thomas said with a slight bow. He then moved on, his polite, professional mask falling back into place as he approached the trio. The exchange was brief and quiet, but it had not gone unnoticed. Richard, who had been scrolling through his phone, glanced over, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He had seen the different quality of the smile, the warmth in the flight attendant's voice. He couldn't place it, and it bothered him. "Get this," Beatrice said, holding up a small amenity kit. "The brand of lotion isn't the one they had last month. It's simply unacceptable. They're cutting corners everywhere." The woman in the gray sweater, whose name was known to Thomas, but not to her fellow passengers, simply closed her eyes for a moment, blocking them out. She wasn't here for the lotion or the champagne. She was here to get from one place to another, to close a distance between herself and someone she loved. The luxury was a pleasant bonus, a quiet space to think and read, but it was not the reason for her journey. She felt a sense of pity for them, for their constant need to judge and complain, their inability to simply be. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, a gilded cage where the bars were made of expectations and brand names. As the last passengers boarded, and the cabin doors began to close, the hum of the plane's system seemed to grow louder, a gentle vibration that could be felt through the floor and up into the seats. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, their practiced movements a graceful ballet. The trio paid no attention, Beatrice already critiquing the quality of the blanket provided, while the woman in the gray sweater watched with a quiet focus, as if seeing it for the first time. She understood the gravity of what they were about to do. The miracle of defying gravity in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. It was a thought that always filled her with a sense of wonder, a feeling that seemed completely lost on the people just a few feet away from her. The stage was set, the characters in their places. The long flight had only just begun, but already silent battle between quiet dignity and loud arrogance had begun its first act. The plane climbed steadily, the city below shrinking into a glittering tapestry of lights that soon faded into the blackness of the night sky. Inside the first-class cabin, a gentle hum settled over everything, the sound of the engines a constant soothing vibration. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the passengers. The world outside the window was a breathtaking spectacle of stars and the faint curved edge of the earth. a view that inspired awe and silence. But not for everyone. Finally, the man in the pinstripe suit declared, unbuckling his belt with a loud click. He stretched his arms out, his elbows intruding into the personal space of the empty seat beside him. I thought we'd never get off the ground. I have a very important meeting in the morning, and this delay has already cost me valuable preparation time. The older woman with the silk scarf, Beatrice, gave a dramatic sigh of her own. Tell me about it. I need my beauty sleep, and this stress is simply terrible for the skin. She pulled a compact mirror from her handbag and began to meticulously reapply her lipstick. Her movements sharp and precise. The woman in the gray sweater simply watched the world go by. The ascent had always been her favorite part of a flight. It was a physical act of leaving things behind, of rising above the noise and complications of the world below. She found a strange comfort in the temporary suspension of reality, the feeling of being between two places, belonging to neither. She thought of the man waiting for her at the other end of this journey, and a small, private smile warmed her face. He loved the view from the cockpit, but he always said he wished he could see it from her perspective, just once as a passenger. A short while later, the cabin crew sprang into action, their quiet efficiency a stark contrast to the boisterous complaints of the trio. Thomas, the senior flight attendant with the kind eyes, moved through the aisle, handing out large, beautifully designed menus. When he reached the woman in the gray sweater, he paused. "Good evening, ma'am," he said softly. "Our chef has prepared a wonderful menu for this evening. We have a pan-seared scallop starter, followed by a choice of beef Wellington or a herb-crusted cod. And for dessert, a chocolate soufflé with a vanilla crème anglaise. Below da-da-da." She looked up from her book and smiled at him. "It all sounds delicious. Thomas, thank you. But I'm really not very hungry just yet. Perhaps just a cup of hot tea and a simple biscuit later on, if that's all right." "Of course," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "We have a selection of herbal teas. I'll bring you the menu for those in a moment," made a small note on his pad and moved on. His demeanor unchanged as he approached the trio. However, his posture became a little more formal, his smile a touch more guarded. "And for you, sir, madam?" he asked. The man in the pinstripe suit snatched the menu from his hand without looking at him. "We'll have one of everything," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "And a bottle of the Dom Perignon, the 2008, if you have it. And don't be shy with the refills." He then turned to Beatrice. "What do you think, my dear? Shall we start with the caviar?" "Oh, absolutely," Beatrice purred, not even glancing at the menu. "And bring us some of that champagne first. We need to wash away the memory of that dreadful lounge." Thomas's smile remained fixed, but a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or just tired resignation passed through his eyes. "Very good, sir. I'll see to it right away." As Thomas walked away, Beatrice leaned towards the younger woman, Tiffany. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice carrying easily in the quiet cabin. "Tea and a biscuit. Can you imagine? On a flight like this. It's almost insulting." The man Richard let out a loud barking laugh. "Insulting? It's pathetic. Some people have no idea how to live. They probably save up for a year for one ticket in first class, and then think ordering a cup of tea makes them sophisticated." He looked pointedly in the direction of the woman in the gray sweater, a sneer playing on his lips. The woman heard every word. It was impossible not to. She didn't turn her head. She didn't show any sign of having heard them. Instead, she focused on the book in her lap, on the story of ancient mariners who had sailed into unknown waters with nothing but the stars to guide them. Their problems, she thought, had been a little more pressing than a disappointing choice of champagne. She felt a pang of pity for them. They were surrounded by luxury, yet they seemed to derive no joy from it, only a sense of entitlement and a need to belittle others. Their world was very small, confined to the narrow definitions of status and wealth. Thomas returned with a silver bucket of ice, glistening bottle of champagne nestled inside. He presented it to Richard with a flourish. "Your Dom Perignon, sir." He poured the golden liquid into 3 fluted glasses, his movements practiced and precise. Richard took a sip and swirled it around in his mouth before swallowing. "Acceptable," he declared, as if he were a connoisseur and not just a man with a big expense account. But the temperature could be better. You must pay more attention to these things. Of course, sir. My apologies, Thomas said, his voice perfectly level. The trio began their feast, their voices growing louder and more animated with each glass of champagne. They talked about people the woman had never heard of, derided business rivals, and bragged about their recent acquisitions. It was a performance, and she was the unwilling and apparently most interesting member of the audience. I mean, look at her, Beatrice said, gesturing with a piece of bread towards the woman's row. That sweater. It's so plain. It looks like something you'd buy in a market. And that book? It's probably some trashy romance novel. It's the shoes that get me, Tiffany chimed in, eager to please. They're so sensible. It's like she's dressed for a walk in the park, not a flight across the Atlantic. She just doesn't fit in here. They were right, of course. She didn't fit in. She had no desire to. Her comfort came from soft fabrics and broken-in shoes, not from scratchy labels and stiff new leather. Her mind was a world away, sailing on uncharted oceans. While they were trapped in the shallow, repetitive cycle of their own self-importance, the woman turned a page in her book. The story was about a cartographer who had spent his life trying to map a coastline that no one else believed existed. He had been ridiculed, called a fool and a dreamer, but he had persisted, driven by a quiet belief in his own vision. She felt a kinship with him. Later, the crew cleared away the remnants of the trio's lavish meal. Thomas returned to the woman's side. He carried a small tray with a delicate porcelain cup, a teapot, and a plate with 2 shortbread cookies on a doily, your chamomile tea and biscuits. Ma'am, he said quietly, placing the tray on her fold-out table. Thank you. Thomas, she said, looking up at him and giving him a grateful smile. This is exactly what I wanted. He lingered for a moment, his eyes briefly flicking towards the trio. We're now complaining about the quality of the coffee. Is everything to your satisfaction? He asked, his voice low. Everything is perfect, she replied softly. Thank you for asking. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and moved away. The small act of kindness felt like a shield, quiet acknowledgement that she was not alone in her observation of the cabin's toxic atmosphere. She poured the steaming, fragrant tea into the cup. The aroma was calming. She took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through her. The trio, however, had not finished with her. It's like watching a nature documentary, Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. Observing a strange creature in its unnatural habitat? She thinks her quiet little act makes her seem mysterious and superior. But we know what she really is, don't we? Just someone who's completely out of her depth, Beatrice finished for him. It's a shame, really. It cheapens the entire experience for the rest of us. They should have a separate section for her kind. The words were meant to wound, to humiliate. And for a fleeting moment, they did. A sharp pang of anger shot through her. Who were they to judge her, to place her in a category and dismiss her? But the anger was quickly replaced by a profound sense of sadness. They were so caught up in their own little drama, so desperate for validation, that they had to create an antagonist in a woman who just wanted to read her book and drink her tea in peace. She didn't react. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Instead, she picked up one of the shortbread cookies. It was buttery and crumbly and delicious. She took a small bite and savored it, her eyes fixed on the vast, star-filled sky outside her window. They could have their champagne and their loud, empty conversations. She had her tea, her book, her thoughts, and the memory of her husband's smile. She had everything she needed. And in the quiet war of wills being waged in the first-class cabin, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was the one who was truly rich. The long hours of the flight stretched out, a silent, dark river flowing through the night. The cabin lights had been dimmed, casting most of the first-class pod into a soft, shadowy glow, punctuated by the small, personal reading lamps. The trio had finally exhausted their supply of loud complaints and self-aggrandizing stories. Richard was snoring softly, his mouth slightly open, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Beatrice was flicking through a glossy magazine, her face a mask of bored dissatisfaction, her eyes barely registering the expensive clothes and jewelry on the pages. Tiffany was trying to watch a movie on her screen, but she kept fidgeting, pulling at her blanket and sighing dramatically, as if the very act of being still was a physical torment. The woman in the gray sweater had finished her book. She closed it gently, the soft thud barely audible above the hum of the engines. She placed it carefully in her tote bag, and for a moment she simply sat, looking out the window at the infinite star-dusted blackness. It was a view that never got old, a reminder of how small she was, and how small everyone's problems were in the grand scheme of things. From her bag, she took a small worn leather wallet. Inside, tucked into a clear plastic sleeve, was a photograph. It was a simple picture, not taken by a professional. It showed a man with a warm, crinkly-eyed smile and a head of thick, dark hair that was just starting to show a few distinguished threads of silver at the temples. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and had his arm around her, pulling her close. She was laughing in the photo, a genuine head-thrown-back laugh that made her eyes sparkle. They were standing on a windswept beach, the sky behind them a brilliant cloudy blue. She traced the outline of his face with her thumb, a familiar, comforting gesture. He was her anchor, the calm in her storm. He was the reason she was on this plane, hurtling through the darkness towards him. Her quiet moment of reflection was shattered by a loud, theatrical yawn from Beatrice. "Well, I, for one, am completely bored," Beatrice announced to no one in particular, her voice cutting through the peaceful quiet. "This is the problem with these long-haul flights. The service is so intermittent. They feed you and then they just abandon you." Tiffany put her movie on pause. "I know, it's awful. I can't even sleep. And my skin feels so dry from the cabin air." Richard snorted in his sleep and then woke up with a jolt. "What? What is it?" he mumbled, blinking his eyes. "We're bored, Richard," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with impatience. "And that woman over there is still just sitting there, doing nothing. It's unnerving." All three of them turned their heads to look at her. She had put the photo away and was now just gazing out the window, a serene expression on her face. Her lack of activity, her simple contentment, seemed to offend them to their very core. "It's like she's in a trance," Richard said, rubbing his eyes. "Probably the most exciting thing that's ever happened to her. Looking out of a plane window. Sad, really." This was it. This was to be their final grand performance of arrogance. They were bored and she was their entertainment. Beatrice decided to deliver the coup de grace. She didn't bother to lower her voice. She wanted the entire cabin to hear her wisdom. "It's a shame when they let just anyone into first class," she said, her voice laced with a venomous condescension. "It really lowers the tone. Some people simply have no class, no appreciation for the finer things. You can give them the seat, but you can't give them the breeding." It's clearly her first time in the air, and she's completely out of her depth. The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The woman didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She just kept looking out at the stars, a single, silent island in a sea of malice. But inside, a small, cold fire had been lit. She was tired of their cruelty, their petty, small-minded judgments. She thought of the man in the photograph, a man who treated every single person, from the CEO to the baggage handler, with the same quiet respect. He would have been disappointed by this scene, but not surprised. He had seen this kind of behavior many times before, just as Beatrice was about to add another insult. The plane gave a sudden, violent lurch. It was a gut-wrenching drop, as if the aircraft had hit a large, invisible pothole in the sky. The lights flickered for a second. A few gasps echoed through the cabin. The trio's reaction was immediate and hysterical. Beatrice let out a piercing shriek and grabbed the armrests, her knuckles turning white. Her face, usually a mask of controlled superiority, was a picture of pure terror. Tiffany started to cry, small whimpering sounds that were somehow more pathetic than loud sobs. Richard, the blustering financier, was frozen in his seat, his eyes wide with a primal fear that his money and his suits could not protect him from. "What's happening?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Is this normal? Make it stop. But the woman in the gray sweater barely moved. When the plane dropped, her hands had instinctively gone to the armrests, but her grip was gentle, not desperate. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a slow, steady breath, and then opened them again. She knew this feeling. She had spoken to her husband about it many times. He called it air pockets, a normal, if sometimes unpleasant, part of flying. He had explained the physics of it, the science behind the bumps. She trusted him. She trusted the plane. She trusted the crew. The plane continued to bump and shake for another minute. The trio remained a tableau of panic. Beatrice was muttering prayers under her breath. Richard was cursing under his. And Tiffany was rocking back and forth, her eyes squeezed shut. The woman, however, was a picture of calm. She straightened her back, looked out the window as if she were studying the turbulence, a scientist observing a phenomenon. Her quiet composure in the face of their shared fear was a more powerful rebuke than any words she could have spoken. It was a silent, unshakable testament to a strength they couldn't even comprehend. Then, suddenly as it started, the turbulence stopped. The plane smoothed out, the humming of the engines returning to its steady, reassuring rhythm. The seatbelt sign pinged off. The trio slowly unclenched their fists, their faces pale and sweaty. They looked at each other, a shared, unspoken shame passing between them. They had been stripped of their pretense, reduced to their most basic, fearful selves. And in that moment of flustered, embarrassed silence, Beatrice, desperate to regain some semblance of her former dominance, made one last, terrible mistake. She looked at the woman, who was now calmly sipping a glass of water that a flight attendant had brought her during the bumps. "Well, at least some of us know how to behave with decorum," Beatrice said, her voice shaky, but still laced with spite. "It's clearly a matter of upbringing. Some people are just more stable than others." The words had barely left her lips when a soft click echoed through the cabin, followed by the friendly, warm voice of the captain over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for that slight bump in our journey. We've passed through the patch of rough air, and I'm happy to report we should have a smooth ride for the remainder of our flight. We're currently on course and on schedule for our arrival." The trio let out a collective sigh of relief, their postures relaxing. But the captain wasn't finished. His voice changed then, becoming even warmer, more personal, as if he were speaking to a single person. On a personal note, he continued, "I'd like to give a very special welcome to a wonderful passenger who is on board with us today, my wife Eleanor. I know you don't love flying, my love, so thank you for making the trip. We're all so glad you're here. This is Captain Davies from the flight deck, wishing you a comfortable rest of your journey." The name of the airline was Davies International. The cabin went utterly, completely silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with shock and dawning horror. The color drained from Beatrice's face, leaving it a pasty, ghastly white. Her mouth fell open slightly, but no sound came out. Richard stared at his hands, which were trembling in his lap, as if they belonged to a stranger. He looked as if he were going to be sick. Tiffany's eyes were wide with a dawning, catastrophic realization, a silent scream trapped in her throat. They all understood. Every word, every sneer, every condescending glance they had directed at the quiet woman now came rushing back at them with the force of a physical blow. Thomas, the senior flight attendant who was standing near the front of the cabin, allowed himself a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. He met Eleanor's eyes in the reflection of a dark window, and she gave him a small, grateful nod in return. They had known all along. Eleanor herself simply looked up towards the closed cockpit door, a soft, private smile on her lips. She didn't look at the trio. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The universe, in the form of her husband's voice, had delivered the final, perfect verdict. A few minutes later, as the cabin was still processing the announcement, the cockpit door opened. Captain Davies stepped out. He was tall and handsome, his face kind and open, his dark hair with its silver wings exactly as it was in the photograph. He wore his captain's uniform with an easy confidence, the 4 stripes on his epaulets, a clear, undeniable symbol of his authority. He ignored every other passenger in the cabin. He didn't even glance in the direction of the trio, who had shrunk into their seats trying to make themselves invisible. He walked with a steady, purposeful stride directly to Eleanor's row. He knelt beside her seat, his head level with hers. The intimacy of the gesture was breathtaking. "Hey you," he said, his voice full of a love so pure and genuine it was almost painful to witness. "I heard it got a little bumpy. Are you okay?" He gently took her hand in his thumb stroking her knuckles. It was a simple, quiet act of affection, but it was more powerful than any of the loud, expensive displays the trio had engaged in all night. "I'm fine, David," she said softly, her eyes shining. It was nothing. He looked up then, his gaze sweeping over the now hushed group of elites. He didn't say a word to them. He didn't need to. His look was enough. It was a look of quiet disappointment, of profound sadness at their behavior. It was a look that held all the power in the world, a power that had nothing to do with money or designer labels. He stood up, but he kept hold of Eleanor's hand. He addressed the flight attendant, his voice polite but firm, carrying clearly in the silent cabin. "Thomas," he said, "please ensure my wife has anything she desires for the rest of the flight." "Anything at all." "Of course, Captain," Thomas replied. His voice filled with respect, Captain Davies gave Eleanor's hand one last gentle squeeze before turning and walking back to the cockpit, leaving behind a charged, unbreachable silence. He had closed the door on them, shutting them out of his world, a world they had so foolishly tried to mock. Asterisk. The silence that followed the captain's return to the cockpit was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from threads of shock, shame, and dawning horror. It pressed down on the first-class cabin, so thick that it seemed to muffle the steady, reassuring hum of the engines. The trio, who had been the masters of this small, enclosed world just moments before, were now prisoners within it. Trapped in the unbearable quiet of their own making, Beatrice sat frozen, her face a pasty, ghastly white. The expensive silk scarf around her neck felt like a noose. She stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, seeing nothing but a rapid, humiliating replay of every condescending word she had spoken. The memory of her own voice, dripping with venom, saying, "It's clearly her first time in the air," echoed in her head with the force of a scream. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Beside her, Richard was a deflated balloon. The bluster, the arrogance, the pinstriped armor of his superiority had all been punctured, leaving him small and shriveled. He stared at his hands, which were resting limply in his lap. They looked alien to him, the hands of a fool. He had ridiculed a woman for drinking tea, for her simple clothes, for her quiet dignity. And that woman was the wife of the man who commanded this metal tube, the man who held their lives in his hands. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like acid in his throat. He didn't dare look at Beatrice or Tiffany. He couldn't bear to see his own shame reflected in their eyes. Tiffany had completely withdrawn. She had pulled her thin blanket up to her chin, her face turned towards the window, pretending to be asleep. But her eyes were wide open, darting back and forth in a panic. She was young, and her world was built on the approval of people like Beatrice and Richard. Now, that world had crumbled. She had been a willing participant in the cruelty, laughing at the jabs, eager to please. The guilt was a hot, sickening wave that washed over her. She wished for nothing more than to become invisible. The woman, Eleanor, remained a portrait of calm. She had not looked at them once since the captain's announcement. She had simply accepted a glass of water from Thomas, taken a small sip, and then turned her gaze back to the window. She was an island of serenity in a sea of roiling humiliation. Her lack of reaction was not a sign of indifference. It was a sign of a power so absolute that it required no demonstration. She had nothing to prove, and they had nothing left. The quiet power dynamic of the cabin shifted with the subtlety of a tide. Thomas, the senior flight attendant, re-emerged from the galley. He walked past the trio's row without a glance, his professional smile completely absent. He moved directly to Eleanor's side, his posture once again warm and respectful. "Mrs. Davies," he said, his voice low and gentle. "The captain mentioned you skipped dinner. Our chef would be delighted to prepare anything you would like." A fresh soup, perhaps? Or the beef Wellington, if you're feeling hungry now. Eleanor looked up at him and gave him a tired but grateful smile. That's very kind, Thomas. A simple soup would be wonderful, thank you. And maybe another cup of that chamomile tea. Of course, he said, beaming. It will be my pleasure. As he walked back to the galley, the aroma of something warm and savory began to drift through the cabin. It was the smell of simmering vegetables and rich broth, a comforting, nourishing scent. For the trio, it was the smell of their defeat. It was a reminder that while they had been served their prepackaged, mass-produced meal, a fresh, personal meal was being prepared for the woman they had scorned. A few minutes later, Thomas returned. He carried a small, elegant tray. On it was a porcelain bowl of steaming soup, a small plate of warm artisanal bread, and a fresh pot of tea. He placed it carefully on Eleanor's fold-out table, arranging everything with the precision of an artist. "Is there anything else at all I can get for you?" he asked. "A blanket? A pillow? Another book from our collection?" "No, this is perfect, Thomas." "Thank you so much," she said softly. He gave a slight bow and walked away, his mission accomplished. He had not ignored the trio out of malice, but as focused. Attentive care for Eleanor served as a stark, undeniable contrast to their new reality. They were no longer the most important people on the plane. They were, in fact, the least. It was Beatrice who broke. The hunger, combined with the gnawing humiliation, was too much to bear. She pressed her call button, a sharp, demanding buzz that cut through the quiet. A junior flight attendant, a young woman with a serious expression, hurried over. "Yes, madam," she asked, her voice polite but devoid of any warmth. "I would like a snack," Beatrice said, trying to inject her usual authority into her voice, but it came out as a thin, reedy squeak. "And a glass of champagne. The good stuff this time." The flight attendant consulted her small screen. "I'm sorry, madam. The meal service is complete. We have some pretzels and shortbread cookies available, and the bar is closed for the remainder of the flight." Beatrice stared at her, incredulous. "Closed? What do you mean it's closed?" "I demand to speak to your senior attendant." "Thomas is currently assisting other passengers," the attendant said calmly. "I can take a message for him." Defeated, Beatrice sank back into her seat. "Just bring me the pretzels," she mumbled. The word tasting like ash in her mouth, the young woman returned a moment later, with a small basket of miniature pretzel packs. She handed it to Beatrice without a word and moved on. It was the same snack they gave to passengers in economy. The final insult? Richard didn't even try. He just sat there, a hollowed-out man. He watched as Eleanor slowly sipped her soup, a small, contented smile on her face as she looked out at the dawn breaking over the clouds. He saw the way the morning light caught the silver in her husband's hair when the captain came out of the cockpit one last time to stretch his legs before the descent. Captain Davies didn't speak to anyone. He just walked the length of the first-class cabin, a slow, casual patrol. He nodded to a couple of other passengers who were awake, but his path was clearly leading to one place. He stopped at Eleanor's row and leaned down, his voice a low murmur that was nonetheless audible in the deathly quiet cabin. "Almost there, my love," he said, his hand resting gently on the back of her neck. "Weather is beautiful. We'll be on the ground in about an hour." She looked up at him, her face filled with a genuine, unadorned love that was more powerful and valuable than all the designer labels and stock portfolios in the world. "I can't wait," she said softly. He smiled, gave her neck a gentle squeeze, and walked back to the flight deck. He had not once acknowledged the existence of the trio. They were ghosts, shadows, less than nothing. Their money, their status, their loud arrogance had been rendered completely meaningless by the quiet strength of a man who treated his wife with love, and a woman who needed no one's approval but her own. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the PA system once more, giving the standard arrival information. The trio listened in silence, each of them dreading the moment the seatbelt sign pinged off. The flight was almost over, but their punishment was just beginning. They would have to walk past her, past the crew who now watched them with open contempt. They would have to collect their bags and step out into the real world, carrying the crushing weight of their own ugliness. They had paid for a first-class ticket, but they were leaving the flight as something far less. They had been given a priceless lesson in humanity, and it had cost them their dignity. The wheels of the plane touched down with a gentle screech and a series of soft bumps, a familiar sensation that usually brought a sense of relief. But for the trio huddled in their seats, it was the sound of the gallows trapdoor opening. The flight was over, but their ordeal was just beginning. The plane slowed, taxiing smoothly towards the gate, and the final dreadful wait began. Around them, the quiet sounds of travel resumed, the click of seatbelts unfastening, the low murmur of voices, the rustle of jackets being pulled from overhead bins. But for Beatrice, Richard, and Tiffany, the world had shrunk to the suffocating space of their own shame. They did not move. They sat rigidly in their seats, staring straight ahead, desperately avoiding any eye contact with the cabin crew or the other passengers. They knew what was coming. They had seen the captain's final, possessive glance towards his wife. They knew they would be made to wait, to watch, to have their humiliation prolonged, and they were right. A soft chime announced that the door was disarmed. Captain Davies emerged from the flight deck, his presence once again filling the cabin with an unspoken authority. He didn't look at the trio. He walked directly to Eleanor's row, his movements relaxed and purposeful. He took her worn tote bag from the overhead compartment with an easy grace, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Ready, my love?" he asked, his voice a low, intimate murmur that carried in the quiet cabin. Eleanor nodded, standing up and smoothing down her simple gray sweater. She looked tired, but there was a peace about her, a quiet contentment that was more radiant than any diamond. She took his hand, and together they stood for a moment. A portrait of a couple completely at ease with each other and with the world. Thomas and the other flight attendants had lined up near the forward door, silent, respectful guard of honor. Their faces were turned towards Eleanor and the captain, their expressions warm and genuine. As the couple began to walk down the aisle, Thomas spoke, his voice clear and sincere. "Thank you for flying with us. Mrs. Davies, we hope you have a wonderful visit. Thank you all." "Thomas," she replied, her smile reaching her eyes. "It was lovely, as always." The captain gave a final, acknowledging nod to his crew before leading Eleanor towards the exit. They didn't look back. They didn't gloat. They simply left, as any other couple would, disappearing through the door that led to the air bridge. They were gone, but their presence lingered, a palpable force that left the trio feeling smaller than ever. Now it was their turn. The other first-class passengers, who had witnessed the entire drama unfold, began to gather their things and move into the aisle. They were a silent audience, and their quiet, knowing glances were like tiny needles pricking the skin of the humiliated trio. Beatrice was the first to move, her movements stiff and robotic. She felt as if she were walking to her own execution. The aisle, which she had strutted down with such confidence on her way in, now seemed miles long. She could feel the eyes of the flight attendants on her. When she reached Thomas at the door, he didn't meet her gaze. He simply looked past her, his professional smile a cold, fixed mask. "Have a pleasant day, madam," he said, the words devoid of any warmth. Richard followed, his head bowed. His pinstripe suit felt like a clown costume. He, the great financier, the master of the universe, had been reduced to a whimpering fool on a plane. He thought about the captain, a man who commanded a multi-million-dollar aircraft and treated everyone with respect. And he felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it made him feel physically ill. Thomas's "have a pleasant day, sir" was a final cutting dismissal. Tiffany was last. She walked with her head down, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her hand, feeling less like a status symbol and more like a mark of her own foolishness. She didn't dare look up at Thomas. She just wanted to escape, to disappear into the anonymity of the airport and never see any of these people again. The polite, cool "have a pleasant day." This was the final nail in the coffin of her pride. They stepped through the door and into the long, sterile corridor of the air bridge. The moment they were out of sight of the cabin crew, the fragile bond that held them together shattered. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at each other. They just walked 3 separate islands of misery, the distance between them growing with every step. The shared arrogance that had united them at the beginning of the flight had evaporated. Leaving only the bitter taste of shared shame, they emerged into the arrivals hall, a cacophony of noise and motion. The crowd of travelers rushing to their next destination should have been a welcome relief, a place to get lost. But for the trio, the anonymity felt hollow. They were ghosts, haunted by the memory of their own behavior as they walked. Richard's eyes caught a large digital billboard on the wall. It was an advertisement for the airline. The slogan read, "Davies International, where every journey is personal." And underneath, a smiling photograph of Captain Davies, the same warm, crinkly-eyed smile from the photograph Eleanor had been looking at. Richard quickly looked away, his stomach churning. Beatrice saw it too. The name Davies. She had been on dozens of flights with this airline. But she had never paid attention to the name of the man who founded it, the man who still flew the planes. She had been too busy critiquing the champagne and the blankets. The irony was a physical blow. She had mocked the owner's wife, thinking her a nobody, when in fact, she was more of a somebody than Beatrice could ever hope to be, not because of who she was married to, but because of who she was. Tiffany saw the sign and felt a tear slide down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. She had wanted so badly to be like Beatrice and Richard, to be part of their world of sharp comments and expensive things. But now she saw it for what it was, a shallow, empty, and cruel existence. The quiet woman in the gray sweater, with her simple clothes and her book and her cup of tea, had more class, more wealth of spirit than all of them combined. It was a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. They reached the baggage claim area, a sea of tired faces and spinning suitcases. They stood in silence, watching the black conveyor belt circle round and round. There was nothing left to say. The performance was over. The audience had gone home. They were left alone with the wreckage of their own egos. One by one, their bags appeared. Beatrice's expensive LV trunk, Richard's leather briefcase, Tiffany's designer roller bag. They looked garish and out of place, symbols of a world that had just been proven to be meaningless. They collected their luggage without a word. Richard was the first to leave. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the 2 women and then walked away. His shoulders hunched, disappearing into the crowd. He was probably already on his phone trying to do damage control, worrying about the business implications of his stupidity. Beatrice watched him go, her face a hard, bitter mask. She then turned to Tiffany, but there was no condescension in her eyes, only a shared, weary defeat. She didn't say goodbye either. She just grabbed her heavy suitcase and walked off in the opposite direction. Her usual confident stride replaced by a shuffling gait. Tiffany was left alone. She pulled her bag behind her, the wheels squeaking on the polished floor. She felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted. It was the weight of trying to be someone she wasn't. The flight had been a nightmare, a humiliating ordeal. But as she walked out of the airport and into the bright morning sun, she knew she had learned something invaluable. She had learned that true luxury wasn't about a first-class ticket or a designer handbag. It was about kindness. It was about respect. It was about the quiet dignity of a woman who needed no one's approval because she was secure in the love of a good man, and in the person she was. And as for Eleanor, she was already in a car, her head resting on her husband's shoulder, telling him about the book she had read. The flight, the people, the cruelty, it was already fading into the background, an unpleasant but ultimately insignificant detail. She was home or on her way there, and that was all that had ever mattered.